If you've been keeping up with the news about Redfall as of late, you'll know that renowned games journalist Jason Schreier of Bloomberg recently posted his exposé on the development of Redfall, revealing many of the reasons why the game turned out how it did, as well as where the idea of an online, multiplayer-focused Arcane game originated from. There's a lot to talk about, so let's just jump right into it. Development of Redfall began in 2018. At the time, ZeniMax, the large privately held owner of Bethesda Softworks, was looking to sell itself. Behind the scenes, the company was encouraging its studios to develop games that could generate revenue beyond the initial sales, a popular trend dubbed games as a service, which was taking off in the late 2010s thanks to lucrative hits like Overwatch and Fortnite. According to people familiar with the process, ZeniMax was strongly urging developers at its subsidiaries to implement microtransactions, that is, recurring opportunities within games for players to spend real money, say, outfitting their characters. Although this wasn't an absolute mandate, several ZeniMax franchises such as Fallout, Doom, and Wolfenstein would soon release new versions incorporating online multiplayer and monetization options. At Arcane's headquarters in Austin, Harvey Smith and Ricardo Bear, respected industry veterans, were tapped to serve as co-directors of Redfall. Following the commercially unsuccessful release of its sci-fi shooter Prey a year earlier, leadership across the company wanted to make something more broadly appealing. What eventually emerged was the idea to make a multiplayer game in which users would team up to battle vampires and perhaps pay for occasional cosmetic upgrades. Okay, let's get a little bit of the backstory and company hierarchies established here. Arcane Studios is a development team. In other words, they are the people who actually make the game. Bethesda Softworks is the publisher, meaning they do not make the game, they are merely responsible for funding, marketing, and distribution of the game. ZeniMax Media is the parent company of Bethesda Softworks, meaning they are a large corporate entity ruled over by an executive board that answers directly to shareholders who have invested money into the company. This hierarchy of leadership is important to know going forward into the rest of this video, and the reason why is because ZeniMax Media, being the parent company, are the highest on the totem pole, and they ultimately have the final say and give the orders to Bethesda Softworks and the many development teams underneath the Bethesda umbrella. They are the ones who will decide what direction the company will go in or what trends they will chase. In this instance, the trend that the executives at ZeniMax wanted to chase was the live service or recurrent consumer spending model for their games. Selling millions of copies of a $60 game wasn't going to provide enough cash flow to recoup the development costs and marketing budgets, and ultimately wouldn't be enough to turn a profit. The entire slate of games released by Bethesda in 2017, a year prior to Redfall beginning its official development, were high-quality, single-player focused titles, and while all of these games were excellent, games like Prey, Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus, Dishonored: Death of the Outsider, and The Evil Within 2, none of them were commercially successful or sold enough copies to turn a profit for ZeniMax. Their finances were slowly going into the red, and they were losing more money than they were taking in. Like typical greedy executives, they needed more, and so they, as Jason put it, strongly urged their development studios underneath Bethesda to design their games around getting the players to come back again and again, whether that be through microtransactions, loot boxes, season passes, the list goes on. The problem with ZeniMax pushing these studios into making online-focused experiences is that the studios and the developers housed within were at their best when they were producing single-player focused games. Not many of the developers at places like Machine Games, Arcane Studios, or Bethesda Game Studios had any intermediate or even advanced knowledge of how to design and create a multiplayer-focused game from scratch, much less a multiplayer game that would draw players back time after time through in-game monetization. The inherent problem with live service games is that they are literally designed around in-game spending from the consumers to bypass the artificial grind of actually playing the game itself. The design design, therefore, is utterly compromised at a foundational level, and this is part of the reason why games like Fallout 76, Wolfenstein Youngblood, and now Redfall landed with such a loud thud. Back to the article. Since its founding in 1999, Arcane had become known for games called immersive sims, single-player experiences in which players strive to overcome obstacles in multiple ways, from combat to stealth maneuvers. Yet, from the start, Redfall was pitched to staff as a multiplayer Arcane game, which some team members said they found confusing. Whether the sort of gameplay that the studio specialized in would be technically possible in a multiplayer environment was an open question. Developers under Smith and Bear said the two leads were outwardly excited, but as the project progressed, failed to provide clear direction. Staff members said that over time, they grew frustrated with management's frequently shifting references to other games, such as Far Cry and Borderlands, that left each department with varying ideas of what exactly they were making. Throughout the development, the fundamental tension between single-player and multiplayer design remained unresolved. Smith and Bear did not respond to requests for comment. Arcane was also perpetually understaffed, said people familiar with its production. The studio's Austin office employed less than 100 people, sufficient for a relatively small single-player game like Prey, but not enough to compete with multiplayer behemoths like Fortnite and Destiny, which are developed by teams of hundreds. Even additional support from ZeniMax's Wisconsin-based Roundhouse Studios and other outsourcing houses couldn't fill the gaps, they say. Morale at Arcane suffered. Veteran workers who weren't interested in developing a multiplayer game left in droves. By the end of Redfall's development, roughly 70% of the Austin staff who had worked on Prey would no longer be at the company, according to people familiar, as well as a Bloomberg analysis of LinkedIn and Prey's credits. Filling vacancies became a challenge. Within the industry, ZeniMax had a reputation for paying lower than average salaries, and convincing some progressive or moderate video game developers to move to Texas could be difficult due to the state's conservative social policies. Since Redfall wasn't yet announced, the studio couldn't describe its details to prospective employees, a predicament that exacerbated the staffing issues, sources familiar with the process said. Arcane wanted to hire recruits with experience on multiplayer shooters, but the people who applied were, by and large, looking to work on single-player immersive sims. I truly do feel sympathy and anguish for the developers at Arcane Austin, because not only did Harvey Smith and Ricardo Bear struggle to help define for the team exactly what kind of game Redfall was, but the development team itself was experiencing constant turnover, as employees seemingly left in droves because of their unwillingness to work on a multiplayer-focused title. 70% of the team that worked on Prey all those years ago are now no longer employed with Arcane, and you have to understand just how bad it is that they've lost almost 3/4 of their total staff over the course of the last few years. I don't blame the developers who left Arcane because they didn't want to make an online game, nor do I completely blame Harvey Smith or Ricardo Bear, as I'm certain even they struggled to meet the demands placed on their shoulders by the upper management at ZeniMax. However, as the co-leads of the development team, and Harvey being the studio lead at Arcane Austin, it was their duty to provide clear direction for the artists, engineers, designers, and programmers working on Redfall, and in this regard, they failed. I don't want to make it sound like I'm beating up on these guys either, because I genuinely and highly respect them and their body of work. Plus, they just seem like really nice human beings. It just seems that with Redfall, they were placed in a very difficult position, as were the many employees working underneath them. It also doesn't help that from the sound of it, ZeniMax are true penny pinchers and cheapskates, paying their employees a yearly salary far lower than the industry average, and also far lower than what these developers deserve as far as I'm concerned. Moving on, Jason talks in the article about Microsoft's acquisition of ZeniMax and how that affected, or rather didn't affect, the development of Redfall. Meanwhile, on September 21st, 2020, Microsoft purchased ZeniMax for $7.5 billion. It was an ambitious move that gave Xbox control over lucrative franchises such as Doom and Fallout, as well as the upcoming Starfield, a role-playing game from the makers of the wildly popular The Elder Scrolls Scrolls V Skyrim. Although adding Arcane's portfolio wasn't the main goal, it was potentially a nice bonus for Microsoft, particularly if Redfall turned into a hit. The acquisition gave some staff at Arcane hope that Microsoft might cancel Redfall, or better yet, let them reboot it as a single-player game, according to sources familiar with the production. Instead, Microsoft maintained a hands-off approach. Aside from canceling a version of Redfall that had been planned for rival Sony's PlayStation, Microsoft allowed ZeniMax to continue operating as it had before, with great autonomy. Microsoft's Phil Spencer would later say in the Kinda Funny interview that Xbox, quote, didn't do a good job early in engaging Arcane Austin. Still, expectations remained high. During a 2021 press conference, Xbox positioned the Bloody Vampire Extravaganza as one of the company's big upcoming releases, dramatically revealing it as the event's show-stopping finale. Yet during the final frantic months, the remaining Arcane staff found themselves stretched thin, and the debut date was pushed back from Halloween of 2022 to early 2023, and then eventually to May 2nd, 2023. Along the way, Smith and other leaders assured the staff that the game would get exponentially better once the final art was implemented and the bugs were fixed, promising that arcane magic would manifest at the last minute as it had with previous games. Other developers, such as Electronic Arts' BioWare, have been widely criticized for using similar language. In the end, Redfall never coalesced. Several people who played the game in 2021 were shocked to see how little ultimately changed. The final glitchy product felt to some critics like a poor compromise between single-player and multiplayer ideas that failed to please fans of either type of game. Harvey Smith recently said in an interview with the website Eurogamer that early on, he pushed back against the compulsory inclusion of an in-game store, but people who worked on the game said the remarks didn't square with how things played out. For the first 3 years, Redfall had a significant microtransaction plan in place. Only in 2021, with games as a service growing more controversial among gamers, did Arcane finally scrap its unwieldy in-game monetization plans. Recently, Microsoft has said that Arcane will continue working to improve Redfall, but its rough launch only raises the pressure for the rest of the ZeniMax lineup, particularly Starfield, which is scheduled to arrive in September. In the interim, the industry will be watching to see what lessons Microsoft has learned. Even more stuff to unpack here. Firstly, it's insane to think that the developers at Arcane Austin were hoping that Microsoft would intervene and cancel Redfall outright, or completely reboot the project. Personally, having now played through the game to completion, I do think the best outcome would have been for Microsoft to order a complete reboot of Redfall, essentially making the developers retain the in-game assets they created, but repurposing them for a single-player focused version of the game. Maybe I'm just selfish because it's hard having to wait multiple years in between each release from Arcane, but I would not have wanted all of their hard work on Redfall to be tossed in a dumpster, or for any of the developers to think that it was a waste of their time and years of their own personal lives. Secondly, I really don't want to hear Harvey Smith or any of the leads at Arcane use the term arcane magic ever again. The idea of a game floundering throughout its development cycle only to finally have all of the ideas come together right at the very tail end of development is not magic, and it's not a good or sustainable development process either. Jason literally mentioned it in that same paragraph, but just do some research and look up how BioWare infamously had similar issues during the development process for games like Dragon Age Inquisition and Anthem, but they simply wrote it off saying, "Oh, it'll all come together in the end. We've got BioWare magic on our side." Dragon Age Inquisition turned out pretty okay for BioWare, which is just miraculous when you read about the behind-the-scenes snafus that affected that game, but Anthem was a complete and utter disaster from top to bottom, and we all know how that turned out for them. If the leadership team at Arcane Austin are relying on so-called magic to pump out a complete and finished product, then I think Harvey, Ricardo, and the others need to take a serious look at how they're managing the studio and the team. And again, I want to reiterate that I really like Harvey and Ricardo and the other members of Arcane Austin's leadership, so I don't want to make it sound like I'm still beating them up for this, but they definitely need to take some accountability where it matters. Thirdly, I'm pretty appalled that Phil Spencer didn't approach Arcane Studios in the same way that he and his team at Xbox approached Todd Howard and the developers at Bethesda Game Studios. I'm sorry if I sound like a fanboy or a conspiracy theorist here, but blatant favoritism was given to the developers at BGS and Starfield, and Arcane Austin and Redfall suffered as a result of Phil and the Xbox team's number one, lack of open communication, and number two, severe lack of a willingness to provide assistance or step in and provide clearer design direction for the game and the team. I mean, they even canceled the PlayStation 5 version, so you guys could do that, but you couldn't help them actually develop the game proper on your own platform or on PC? Like, come on, Phil. I'm sure Phil is a really nice guy, at least he comes off that way in his interviews and public appearances, and he did also apologize quite frankly and earnestly for Redfall's launch state, but he still monumentally failed the Arcane Austin team and didn't give them the help that they desperately needed. Finally, getting to probably my most important point that I want to stress with this video, I place the massive majority of the blame at the feet of the former ZeniMax executives who decided that Bethesda should just pivot their games and IPs completely into live service and online focused experiences, all because of short-sighted greed and making off with a larger-than-life payday. The ZeniMax executives who sold off Bethesda to Microsoft made out like bandits with $7.5 billion between them, and clearly not a care in the world for the well-being of their studios, their employees, and their library of intellectual property. By doing this, they killed so much goodwill that they earned from their most loyal of fans who enjoyed their high-quality, single-player focused games. Fallout 76 was a disaster, and even though it's now in a much better place with a small but devoted community of players, it has done irreparable damage to the Fallout brand. Wolfenstein Youngblood was, at best, a somewhat decent co-op shooter that quickly became repetitive and grindy, and that's not even mentioning the subpar narrative and utterly disgusting in-game purchases. Redfall is now the latest and probably final entry in this trilogy of failed Bethesda live service titles, but the people who were ultimately responsible for one of, in my opinion, the worst eras of Bethesda games are now gone. They left with their golden parachute and are probably sunbathing on their yachts somewhere in the Caribbean. These are the people that I, without mincing words, utterly despise for ruining some of my favorite franchises and tarnishing the reputation and goodwill of my favorite video game developers. If you want to watch someone give a far more organized and articulated stance on all of this, I would definitely recommend that you watch Luke Stevens' video on the Redfall Bloomberg article. A lot of the stuff I'm saying here, he said far more eloquently than I. So definitely check out his video when you have a chance, and I'll leave a link to that video in the description box down below. Now, with pretty much all of my thoughts laid bare about the Bloomberg article and Redfall's rocky development, I now leave it in your hands. What do you think about all of this? Have you read Jason Schreier's expose on Redfall? If you have, what are your own thoughts on the matter? Do you think that Arcane Austin will even be able to recover from this? Have you given up on any and all games made by Bethesda, both past, present, and future? Leave a comment down below and let me know. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave a like and share the video with other members of the Bethesda and Arcane Outsiders community. It really helps the channel to grow and get noticed. Consider subscribing to the channel for more Arcane Studios and Redfall content in the future, and be sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. And remember that the outsider walks among us. Thanks for watching, everyone.